They come from different viewpoints, but these concepts overlap to a large extent. Not entirely, but to a large extent. Let's come now to the definition itself. This is the definition of trafficking in persons in the 2000 protocol on trafficking in persons. It requires three things. One is an action, and the action is recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. It's quite wide. Transporting can be, taking someone in your car from one's apartment to, a place of labor. It can be 3 kilometers. It doesn't say, and you notice that it doesn't say across an international border, contrary to smuggling in persons, smuggling in migrants, where you need to cross an international border to have the crime of smuggling. For trafficking in persons, you don't need to cross an international border. It can be an internal phenomenon. And for example, in Canada, it seems that the most important trafficking in person in terms of numbers is about Indigenous women and girls being trafficked into prostitution into the main cities of Canada. So it's internal to Canada. You have then a means of threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, abuse of position of vulnerability, giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. Isn't that convoluted? But this is the means. It has to do with some kind of coercion in the largest sense. And then you have to have a purpose. And the purpose is exploitation. And we go back to the history of the concepts. At a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, but they also include forced labor and slavery, servitude, and removal of organs. And they add something which is interesting: the consent of the victim of trafficking shall be irrelevant. So you see the complexity of this definition. It's not an easy definition to work with.
Thank you very much, Professor Crépeau. That was super interesting. I was waiting for more. So perhaps actually you can tell us a bit more about what these issues, what issues may arise from this type of definition.
Yeah, that should be better, right? Yes. First of all, we have an unclear conceptualization. What is transportation? I mentioned that a few minutes ago. What is deception? Fraud, abuse of power, yes. What is deception? If you tell them I'm going to give you a job, is that deception? What is exploitation? They say it's forced. It may be forced labor or slavery. Again, that overlap of concepts that are not very clearly defined necessarily. The association with the sex trade is all over. Consent is irrelevant, and yet many people who know, for example, we have numerous stories of girls whose older sisters have been recruited in their own village, somewhere, let's say in Eastern Europe, to go and work in the sex trade in Germany or in Britain. And their younger sisters know exactly what's happened because they're on WhatsApp with their sister all the time. And yet they want to go too. They want to go because they hope that for themselves, it's going to be different because the options at home are extremely limited. And when we see that it's transportation with some kind of coercion, what about the exploitation of undocumented migrants? What if you have undocumented migrants who are working for you and you're transporting them every day from where they, found a bed or a room, and you're transporting them to the work where you are, paying them $4 an hour? That seems to fit the definition that I've just mentioned. And yet it doesn't seem to be included inside the definition of trafficking. And that means that it's a definition which is extremely difficult to implement. The complexity is such that everyone dealing with it needs to have huge resources for its implementation. The police would need to do thorough investigations. You have to demonstrate, first of all, one of the means. You have to demonstrate that there has been, for example, transportation. You have to show that there is an intent of exploitation, etc. The prosecutors need to prove all three elements, including the intent. And I have as a statistics that in Canada, 34% of police reported human trafficking incidents were cleared by charge. So there was only 1/3 of all the cases that were signaled, which led to charges. Now, securing the consent of the victims to testify has been extremely difficult everywhere. Why? Simply because victims are much more afraid of their traffickers than of the police and what can be done to them by state authorities. And that is a problem. So it has been tried in several countries, and there are a few examples in each country where, countries have offered a residence permit for 6 months, a year, in order to allow victims to settle down. And several countries have started by making this permit conditional with cooperation with the police. That didn't work very well. When the permit was delinked with the testifying, it worked a little bit more, but the numbers are very low. Trials may take years to happen, and the end result might be an acquittal. And again, statistics from Canada, almost 90% of human trafficking charges were stayed, withdrawn, dismissed, or discharged. So only 1/3 of the cases go to charges, and 90% of the charges don't result in a conviction. So we have extremely low efficiency of that because the definition is so complicated. These humanitarian visas, which have been tried in several countries, are usually given to very few people. And you see in 2020 in Canada, 110, in 2021, 65. And I'll show you the number of cases in Canada in a minute. It's much easier for everyone and much cheaper for everyone. And I'm thinking of the police, immigration officials and prosecutors, etc., to simply go the immigration way. These people don't have appropriate travel documents, residence permit, work permit. Well, we just return them to their country of origin. And very often, many of these people will go back to their town, city, village, and will be recruited again. Because very often the recruitment is done by someone local who knows everyone. And so they're seen back with their family. The person will approach them again, and they will be re-trafficked in the system, so that returning people, expelling people from the country of destination is actually fueling the trafficking trade again. Just to show you the statistics for Canada, the very small numbers. In 2019, there were barely 500 cases reported. And remember, 1/3 of those cases went to charges, and 90% of the charges went nowhere. And on those 500, only 65 people got permits, residence permits, humanitarian residence permits, in order to allow them to settle down and recover from whatever happened to them. So we have a huge problem with that definition, and we don't have consensus at international level as to what is what between forced labor, slavery, and different institutions are playing with different definitions, which are all of them quite difficult to work with. So I'll stop there.
Wow, super interesting. I'm feeling a bit sad that I even asked, but we're here to of course look for solutions. If we don't know about the problem, we can't know about the solution. I'll say maybe just for the audience, if you have any questions, to please take note. We'll have time at the end for Q&A session. I've actually written a few additional ones that I'd love to get answered at some point by Professor Crépeau. That was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. Donc now we're moving on to the question of the legislative framework, and I think this is a super flow because now that we have a good sense of what the issues are, as legal minds, I'm sure have every interest in figuring out what the legislative framework is to help tackle this issue. And for this, I'll turn it over to Ms. Alhaddadin.
Thank you, Martine. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Crépeau, for putting your finger on the pain. We know it's very complicated when it comes to trafficking, slavery, forced labor. We have different definitions, and we have a very large web of international conventions. I will not start from the slavery because you've already mentioned the slavery conventions, which some of even preceded the establishment of the United Nations. But of course, they are still valid and they are very useful, but they don't have teeth. What do I mean? I mean, nobody can implement them because there is no monitoring bodies to oversee the implementation. So I would say, I would divide the legal framework around trafficking in persons and forced labor. By the way, there has been recently an agreement between the main players, UNODC and the ILO, to use the term trafficking for forced labor. So it's a combination of two things, but of course, the definitions vary in the conventions. So let's talk about three bodies of legislation at the international level conventions. First of all, since I come from the Human Rights Office, I will talk about the human rights conventions. On top, of course, of the legal, the human rights machinery, we have the UDHR, which we are celebrating this year, 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, it sets all the standards for the rest of the conventions. We have the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights. Maybe we can go through the screen number 5, please. That covenant prohibits slavery and forced or compulsory labor. So it combines the two issues. The CRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, as well addressed the issue of trafficking in children. We have also CEDAW, the Convention on all forms of discrimination against women, which has been recently doing a lot of work on the issue of trafficking. I had the honor to work with them on producing the General Recommendation number 38 on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration, because as rightly pointed out by Professor Crépeau, it is a big issue, especially those undocumented migrants, and how do we deal with them. And now we are rolling out a set of guidelines on how to implement it. Of course, we are trying our best to facilitate the understanding of all the complex issues around trafficking, as rightly pointed out, but it's not an easy task. We have also some other conventions related to ILO labor rights. On top of that, we have the Forced Labor Convention and the most recently adopted protocol in 2014, which mainly focuses on, or which added a new element to the body of law that is related to compensation. We have also the protocol. Let's move to the protocol, because I fully agree with Dr. Crépeau. The definition of trafficking is really complicated, but I guess
which slide, sorry, please, Youla?
Excuse me?
Which slide were you on now? The protocol?
Number 8.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'm confusing you, but I had to do that because
This is
the
perfect.
connection didn't work.
Thank
So the protocol that includes the definition mentioned earlier is the first and only protocol that addresses the issue of trafficking specifically. It has been ratified by around 180 countries around the world. So there is a consensus on the protocol and on the issue. It mentions exploitation and using or abusing the vulnerability of people, and that tells a lot. The protocol has been researched thoroughly. Each element mentioned before of the definition on trafficking has been thoroughly researched, of course, for practitioners and the use of practitioners and people who are interested in doing more work, but it remains very complicated. The protocol, I would say, is really important in terms of two things. It has two objectives. The first objective, it provided for the protection and assistance to victims. It's the only document that refers to protection and assistance to victims of trafficking. And of course, with full respect to their human rights. The second objective, it's the first globally legally binding instrument with an agreed definition. Whether we like it or not, it is an agreed definition. And this agreed definition should serve as a framework for member states to be able to establish national mechanisms to replicate what is in the convention and the protocol at the national level to be able to combat trafficking. I would like also to mention some policy frameworks because they are important. It's not only about international legal frameworks. Policy frameworks are very important. We have what is called the Global Plan of Action to Combat Trafficking in Persons. This is an agreed document that has been adopted by the General Assembly, and it's much more clearer in highlighting every 3 years when there is an appraisal, what are the pressing issues that we all need to look at. Of course, let alone we're talking about a wide range of resolutions adopted by the General Assembly, by the Human Rights Council, by the Security Council, even in relation to trafficking in conflict and all the surges we have been hearing about from ISIS, from the Lord's Army in all conflicts around the world. So it's really very important. Of course, we have also, the Crime Commission adopts several resolutions that sets policies for member states to be able to address the issue of trafficking, and many other resolutions issued by or adopted by intergovernmental bodies. So I would stop here, and I would like to discuss further later, maybe in our question and answer and discussions. Thank you. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Youla. One question I had, though, I don't know if you wanted to cover that, is in discussion and preparation for this webinar, you discussed the human-based approach, human rights-based approach to addressing the trafficking of persons. Did you want to say a few words about that?
Yes, of course. The human rights-based approach is an approach that has been invented, let me say, by OHCHR, because we have noticed that a lot of states deal with trafficking as a crime only. So the human rights-based approach came as a result of the need to embed human rights within the understanding of the crime of trafficking. So it is simply means that we focus on the victims. We put the interests of the victims and survivors of trafficking at the center of all effective and credible action we might take. And in that way, we guarantee that trafficking or the whole issue is not merely reduced to a problem of population movement, public order, or organized crime. At the practical level, what do we mean by that? We mean, we need to look at all the steps, all the cycles that goes through the trafficking cycle, analyze it, identify what are the issues, who are the duty bearers that are supposed to take action, but they did not, and who are the right holders that the rights needs to be addressed. This approach has been adopted by ECOSOC, by the General Assembly, and it has been widely accepted among member states and other stakeholders, NGOs, civil society organizations. Everybody is applying it. I really feel thrilled when I attend interagency meetings, the UN, and see everybody talking about the human rights-based approach. Because as mentioned by Professor Crépeau, even law enforcement, they do not really grasp what is trafficking. And they go detain everybody in the room, take them to prison without even thinking, there might be some people who are forced to do what they are doing. So this is the approach we have adopted, and we are promoting, and we are really seeing very good results in terms of implementation and application.
Oh, that's very encouraging. Thank you. So now that we have a good sense of sort of what the definition is, what the issues are, what the framework is, I'd love to learn a little bit more about what we're doing to combat, and I'll turn it to Michel. But before, just Youla, one last question around. Sorry, I know you
yes.
Just in terms of monitoring, so that we have a sense of knowing where the issues are. What are the mechanisms that are in place to monitor human trafficking?
And probably the most important recently adopted mechanism is a new mechanism to monitor the implementation of the transnational convention. It's not yet in place. They are still preparing the work. But when it comes to human rights, we have three types of mechanisms. Special procedures, which are the mandate holders. You just referred that Professor Crépeau served as the special rapporteur on migration. We have several country mandates and thematic mandates. The thematic mandates, they undertake visits. They do reports about countries. They receive communication. They give recommendations to member states in order to advise them how to implement and how to monitor trafficking. There is a mandate dedicated to trafficking in persons. Of course, due to COVID, she was not able to do a lot of visits. Now she's back into country visits. We have a mandate on slavery, and we have a mandate on the sale of children. So those three interrelated mandates divide the work and the focus between them. The second issue is the treaty bodies. So all human rights conventions have treaties that monitor their implementation. So several of them, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, they have a mechanism and they have a focus on issues related to trafficking. When they review countries' reports, they issue concluding observations, they give recommendations to states, they ask them to work on certain issues. For example, I'm currently working on a specific country based on a recommendation from CEDAW that requested them to put in place good legislation related to sale of children and surrogacy. So in that way, they give advice to member states. And of course, we can say it's a sort of naming and shaming when a report and a recommendation comes out. The last mechanism is the Universal Periodic Review. It's a sort of a peer review where member states present the reports. Every 2 years, there is a cycle for the reports. And then other members of the Human Rights Council give them the recommendations. So, and I document all the recommendations. We have a huge number of recommendations. I can say every single country on earth who participated in the UPR received recommendations related to trafficking. So we take all that wealth of information and recommendation, the jurisprudence, and we plan our work accordingly. So I know X country has an issue related to national referral mechanism. So I would go there and work with them on designing a national referral mechanism, or draft a legislation, or even establish a shelter for victims of trafficking, or put in place a system for compensation and reparations for victims of trafficking. So in that way, we monitor the implementation. It's not easy, it's very complicated, as the issue is really very complicated. Let me just add one point on the numbers mentioned earlier. And I guess there is a confusion, but the confusion stems from the problem, we don't have the exact numbers because nobody knows. Sometimes it's a secretive crime. And the ILO numbers are estimates. They are not based on real life numbers. They are produced in an office based on a methodology. I took part in contributing to the forced marriage part, so I know the methodology. UNODC report is a very important tool. It does not give numbers because it depends on information received from member states. So if they receive information, they put it in the report. If they don't, they cannot invent the numbers. But it documents trends and movements. So it's really important to understand that trends, what is big now. For example, the most recent report has documented an increase in forced labor, increase in male victims of trafficking. It might be deceiving a little bit because we don't have the correct information, the real information because of the pandemic, all what we went through, but it gives a sort of a trend about issues. So I will stop here. Thank you, Martin.
It's so interesting. I want to hear more, and I want to hear from Michel and Veuthey as well, who has tremendous experience in this area, and I believe who will be telling us a bit more about the tools that are in place to combat trafficking. And Michel, you're on mute. My apologies. It happens once per conference.
That's good.
Oh.
And we ask Stefan to put my slides on. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. As the previous, next slide, as the previous speakers mentioned, human trafficking is the tens of millions today. You know, the figure of 50 million is 10 million more than the entire population of Canada or Ukraine. Okay, these are estimates, as Francois Crépeau said, but it's an order of magnitude. And then the sources for monitoring this plague are, of course, governments. You have, for example, the US State Department publishing an annual report on human trafficking, and international and regional organizations, NGOs like Anti-Slavery International, Human Rights Watch, Mission 89 for sports, FBOs, academia, and the media. And I must say, another figure also estimated and probably conservative is the illicit profit of human trafficking, $150 billion a year. Next slide. Then we have the international legal framework, which is not only the two Palermo protocols, one on human trafficking and the other one on migrant smuggling, but also human rights, and not only at the universal level, but also at the regional level, Council of Europe, I'll come to that later, OAS, EU, ASEAN, and then also labor law, and also international humanitarian law applicable in armed conflicts, international criminal law, which defines slavery as a crime of war and as a crime against humanity, and international maritime law, which could be applied possibly in analogy, and refugee and migrant law, and also the convention relating to the status of stateless persons. Next slide, please. Then I would like to pay tribute, homage to the work of the UN, especially the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the special rapporteurs, of which Professor Francois Crépeau has been an outstanding one. Here are the current incumbents. As you say, not only the special rapporteur on human trafficking, and that's Professor Moulali from Ireland, but you also have a special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, Professor Obokata, a special rapporteur on the sale and sexual exploitation of children, a special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, and a special rapporteur on violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we should not forget the special representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, as you see, 6 grave violations affecting children in times of conflict, recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming of children, sexual violence against children, attacks on schools, abduction of children, denial of humanitarian access. But definitely, many people include child soldiers in victims of human trafficking. Next slide, please. And in addition to the UN, we should not forget the role of regional organizations, and in particular, the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe, you see, has this convention where state parties aim to prevent human trafficking, protect the rights of victims, prosecute perpetrators. And one peculiarity or two specifics of this convention, it has a committee of experts, GRETA, which carries out visits and rolls up and publishes country reports. And then also you have to note that the convention is open to ratification by all states, including states not members of the Council of Europe. Next slide, please. Then definitely another very interesting organization, regional, and Canada, of course, is also a member of OHCHR. OHCHR has appointed a special representative and coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings, Valiant Ritchie, that's an American citizen, and he is doing an excellent work, not only in publishing reports, but also in country visits and organizing also conferences in Vienna and in other places. Then, next slide. I would say we definitely need to have a broader picture and to involve all stakeholders, meaning by that the role of academia, the media, and faith-based organizations is often overlooked in advocacy and protection, but still we also need to include victims and survivors as well, because of course they are the best experts in the field, and possibly they could make good use of their survival to help other victims. Next slide. Then allow me to mention the role of religious communities, not only in advocacy, but also in action. And quite often the rehabilitation of victims is taking a very long time, and you need shelters and reintegration programs. And yes, those good sisters in London are an example of what they could do, not only in Europe, but also in Africa and elsewhere. Next slide. And what we need to do is actually to achieve a broad coalition of stakeholders to indeed effectively prevent human trafficking, identify, protect, and rehabilitate victims and survivors. And you see raising awareness, sharing best practices, promoting measures. Next slide. And then what I would like to say is that obviously governments have also, for example, the Canadian National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking. There is also a Plan National d'Action in France. Those national plans of action are not necessarily perfect, but at least you know what you could aim at, and you could possibly benefit from this. Next slide. And for example, here, that's the US Department of Transportation, and actually you could see that this Federal Highway Administration is member of a president's US President Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking, and a cabinet level entity chaired by the Secretary of State to coordinate federal efforts to combat trafficking persons. So I think this is important because we need also to cooperate within the same government. Next slide. Yes. Voilà. You say also this Polaris. Polaris is an interesting organization supported by the US government and publishing interesting reports. I would like to say, have a look at this one, and you'll see that not only buses, but also, for example, page 29, airlines, and page 36, victim identification. If you are interested, this is a freely available document on internet, and I believe it could be quite useful. Next slide. So first, and I think, Martin, you asked me, what can we do? I agree with the two previous speakers that actually criminal prosecution is not the silver bullet, is not the magic solution, but actually we have to deal with the main causes. And the main causes, there are two main causes we could identify. First, profits without limits, meaning by that without any ethical or social limitations. And second, a culture of waste where people and the environment and the objects are exploitable at will and are disposable. So actually, to do this, we have one way, and I know that's not an easy way, but that's to monitor supply chains. And monitor supply chains from governments, public procurement, monitor supply chains from businesses, and monitor supply chains even from religious communities, because that will dry out the money, which is actually the main cause. The profit, of course, is the main cause of human trafficking. And now, what I would like to say is that this supply chain control, for this we need corporate social responsibility, and we need also a monitoring which could help consumers avoid buying slave labors and products, slave labor products and services. But now, last slide. So I would say my last take-home message is that we must eradicate modern slavery by mobilizing public consciousness to pressure governments, businesses, and consumers to adopt and implement a ban on all forms of slavery. And here I give you the example of two coalitions which at the end of last century, 97-98, achieved a result no one expected. In 1907, that was the Ottawa Convention for the total abolition of anti-personnel landmines. And in 98, the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, which achieved the adoption of the Rome Statute. And as I just said, human trafficking is a crime against humanity as a war crime. But I think it's a similar coalition that we need to achieve the abolition of modern slavery. How many years will it take to eradicate all forms of slavery? We can all agree that this is an urgent task. Let's go to work together, and thank you for your support and attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm trying to get to the mute button here. Sorry. Thank you for this great overview. Very, very enlightening. Clearly, there's no lack of work being done around this issue. It's very comforting. I'm feeling a bit comforted in a way. But obviously there's still a lot of issues. There's lots of questions coming from the audience, which I'm happy to see, and we'll tackle those in a bit. We'll have ample time actually to go through those, so not to worry, and please do continue putting your questions in the chat if you have any. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about aviation, and I actually saw there's a question in the chat about this. We'll turn it over now to Martin Maurino, who was with ICAO, to tell us a little bit about what the air transportation industry is doing about this issue.
Thank you, Martin, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I have a few slides just to walk you through the work that we're doing at ICAO. So ICAO started working on the issue of combating trafficking in aviation a few years ago. I believe Youla and I started working together maybe around 2016. And I think at the time, what was interesting a few years back was when we looked at tackling the issue of trafficking on board aircraft, was trying to figure out how it fit into aviation and also even into ICAO's mandate. So I think typically in aviation, we tend to work sort of in compartments. So some things are safety related, security related, dangerous goods related, facilitation related. So there was a lot of discussions in terms of how does this fit into the work, particularly of ICAO. I think a lot of the work we do at the end of the day is to protect lives, the lives of aircraft occupants and people on the ground. So whether it's preventing a safety related event like an accident, unlawful interference, that's security. So I think it does fit into our mandate. Now, when we looked at it from a UN perspective, because ICAO is the UN agency that deals with civil aviation. So we looked at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and we looked at the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So those call for eradicating trafficking, and they also call for UN agencies to work together. Mm-hmm. So we established collaboration with OHCHR to develop new guidance. So Youla and I work together. And I think, as she mentioned, in terms of being victim-centered, we wanted to focus, I would say, not so much at punishing the criminals, but at the victims and rescuing survivors. So what we worked on first was developing a set of guidelines. I'll go through them. And really the goal was to raise awareness, because I think now, as the years have gone by, it is something we talk about a lot. But a few years ago, it was something that we weren't really talking about in aviation. And also to give some guidelines that are aviation specific, because there is a lot of material already out there, but specifically in aviation, how to train personnel and how to report when you have suspicions on board. So we have an expert group that deals with everything that has to do with facilitation. And at ICAO, we have specific standards and recommended practices in an annex, which is Annex 9 on facilitation. And that looks at all the things that happen, particularly at airports, in terms of clearing immigration, customs, passengers traveling. Interestingly enough, we also addressed unaccompanied minors in this annex. So we already deal with some kind of the vulnerable population. So when we looked at the possibility of having some kind of recommendations and a high level document, because annexes are very high level, this seemed to be a very good fit, even though we'll talk about what happens on the aircraft itself. But we thought this would be a good place to include recommended practices. So these are not requirements right now from ICAO, but they are sort of strong shoulds, if you'd like. And we've had 2 recommended practices that have been put into this annex. One calls for clear reporting systems, and I'll get into that a bit later, in terms of giving point of contact. So if there is a suspected case of trafficking on board, how will airline and airport operators know exactly who to contact? if there is a specific contact point. And also the other recommended practice deals with awareness and training, and particularly for public-facing personnel from the airport and the airline personnel. And that can have a broad definition. I'll talk about the work we've done mainly for the air crew, but when we talk airport, you can talk about check-in staff, duty-free personnel, everybody that passengers will come in contact with. And through that panel, we've also developed a comprehensive facilitation-related strategy for combating trafficking in persons to give really the states the tools in terms of how to address this, specifically in the aviation context. So we had an assembly last year. We have a General Assembly one every 3 years. And we had a resolution. So that's really a very, very high level decision that we take, specific to combating trafficking in persons. And that resolution actually addresses different aspects that you see on screen. It calls for states to implement the recommended practices in Annex 9 that I just mentioned, to also give regards to the guidance material that we created, including Circular 352, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Our comprehensive strategy, that's what is in document 1071. And the Assembly also called for the Council of ICAO to keep working on additional guidance that would meet the needs of states when addressing trafficking in aviation. So we have a group also that we call the ICAO Cabin Safety Group, because as I mentioned, the first round of work we did had to do with aircrew and particularly cabin crew, so flight attendants. So we have, as you can see from the logos here, several airlines that were involved, as well as several regulatory authorities from different states. And we also dealt with not just authorities within aviation, but outside. For example, we had Public Safety Canada, because they're the ones that look at that issue specifically in Canada involved, the US Department of Transport as well, and others that have been involved. So this is the first set of guidelines that we launched, which is Circular 352, and it talks about how to train cabin crews, so flight attendants, in terms of identifying and responding to trafficking. So it'll give an overview, and this can be used across different aviation personnel, not just cabin crew, but what is trafficking in persons? And we've heard about this in some of the previous presentations. What are the elements that need to be included to consider something trafficking? What are the different types of trafficking that you'll see, including sexual exploitation, organ removal, others? What's the difference between smuggling and trafficking? And then we get into indicators. So what are the things that a crew member, a person would see that may indicate that there's a case of trafficking that's happening? And some are very generic, and some are actually quite specific to aviation and the airplane environment. So we've seen cases where typically the victims cannot go to the lavatory by themselves. The trafficker will follow them, will even try to follow them into the bathroom, even if they're told they should go in one at a time. The crew will address them, and they will not really be allowed to answer about, for example, what they want to eat or drink. They won't have any really clue where they're going, or they'll talk about maybe they're going to become a model or an actress without any idea of who's going to meet them. So these are things that, by the crew having interactions with the passengers, because flight attendants tend to talk to people, it's not abnormal to just have kind of a routine discussion, they can see some things are pointing towards a kind of suspicious situation. And then from there, we go into what are the regulatory considerations? What do we ask of the states? What should an airline have in terms of a policy if they think they have cases of trafficking on board? What should be the procedures? And then we get into the cabin crew training in terms of what to train the flight attendants to do. And we have some sample programs. So after we launched this, interestingly enough, when we launched these guidelines, a few airlines actually came forward and really wanted to implement them. And others would come to us and say, well, it's interesting, but we don't really want to do it because the management is afraid that then we're going to get labeled as a trafficking airline. Because if we're addressing it, it means we're saying it's happening on board. And we had to say to airlines and to states, it happens everywhere. And as we heard before, it's not just an international flight question. It happens on regional flights. You don't have to cross an international border. But just because you haven't had reports, it doesn't mean it hasn't happened on your airline. And that's not a reason not to train. I think we've gone away from that mentality now, because I think airlines are recognizing that it's more part of their social responsibility as opposed to somehow being blacklisted. But so we have seen now, I think, more and more that this is part of the curriculum particularly for cabin crew training. Now, after we launched these guidelines, one of the issues that we saw and the feedback we got from several organizations, is that the crew took well to this training. They were eager to report, but a lot of times it wasn't clear how or who to report to. So we would land, they weren't sure who should meet the aircraft, how to do it, people walk off the aircraft, and once they're off the aircraft and out of the airport, it's hard to ever find them again. So again, with OHCHR, we worked on another set of guidelines, this one focusing on how to report. And so this one aimed not just at the cabin crew, but also at the pilots. Because typically the cabin crew would see a suspicion, they would report it to the pilots, and it's the pilots, especially if the aircraft is in flight, that would then communicate with the ground to have authorities meet the aircraft and take action. So we had law enforcement involved, including the RCMP and others that were involved in the development. So we can also hear from law enforcement what kind of information they need. And we've heard also in the previous presentations, yes, it's very hard, in terms of individuals being detained, charged, prosecuted. So the more information law enforcement has, especially if the aircraft is in flight, coming in, for example, from a transatlantic flight, and they do have time, the better they can prepare themselves. So we have a reporting template in there in terms of, and again, we took the feedback from law enforcement, what they would like to receive to help them make that decision, because it will be their call whether to intercept the person or not. And we've outlined roles and responsibilities and also all the reporting procedures that we would want to see. So in terms of what we would like from a state, what ICAO recommends, now we tend to deal primarily with the civil aviation authorities, with the CAAs. So although we ourselves do not require it, I can say yet, we do encourage that from the state level, they require their airlines to have policies, procedures, training and guidance for their employees in terms of how to identify and respond to trafficking. And I think a big part of this is appropriate responses, because a big part of the training isn't just what to do, it's also what not to do. Especially when you're in a cabin in a confined environment, we don't want, as you know, and we've seen this on TV when there's an unruly passenger and 15 people jump them. We don't want to see that in a trafficking case where the cabin crew may want to rescue the victim. We don't know how many other people are involved that are already on board. So they may put themselves and others in danger. So we want to stick to the concept of do no harm. So a lot of the training we also do is how to handle things in a discreet manner, and also what the crew should do versus what the authorities will do, I think, in terms of protection. Now, another challenge we've seen is that typically in aviation, the CAA will oversee pretty much everything. Security can be in a different, I can say, branch, but typically within the Ministry of Transport. I think for trafficking, you are dealing with different agencies inside the country. You're dealing with law enforcement and others. So there has to be some coordination because it's really a multi-stakeholder issue. So it's not something that can be addressed in aviation by itself. We are just one piece because it's a multimodal crime. So people will be transported on aircraft, but then after that, they will take a bus, a ferry. So there's a lot of actors involved. So that would require some coordination. And we encourage the use of the ICAO guidelines in terms of having some harmonized training. From the air operators, the airlines themselves, we know that this is one of the main modes of transport. We are a means to an end for the traffickers. They use the aircraft to move victims. So, and I mean, and you've seen the numbers, even if they're estimates. So it is really likely that crew members, whether they are aware of it or not, will come in contact with victims and traffickers. So we do recommend that for the airlines that there is dedicated policies, procedures. This is all spelled out in the guidelines in terms of how to deal these events. We put cabin crew in the forefront because typically they will be the first point of contact. I think, of course, if you think about long flights like transatlantic flights, the crew will spend hours in a cabin with passengers. So they do have the opportunity during meal service while walking around to spot if something, you know, and this is usually how the crew will say it, something seems off with a passenger that's traveling with a child, for example, something like that. So we really feel that because of the amount of contact they spend with passengers, they are really the first point of recognition on board. And then the second point is really the pilots, because they're the ones who will then have to contact the ground. And you have a link at the bottom. I guess the presentation will be available. We have developed with OHCHR an e-learning course that you can take, and that we've also done really for airlines who don't have the budget. and that covers all the points that are in the guidelines. And it has, for example, a testimonial of a survivor who was transported by air. We also have several case studies of actual cases that we've seen, and what triggered suspicion and what the outcomes were. And then the last thing I want to touch on, this is actually work that we're starting now, that Youla, myself, and others, IATA's involved, and we have airlines and states involved. It's a bit of a different topic than aircrew, but we're looking at how to tackle trafficking and exploitation in the airline industry supply chain. So it's something that's on the way. We have an expert group that's looking at this. This can apply for airports or others, but we're focusing now on air operators. So in terms of anything from who cleans the plane, the catering that's brought on board, the security that's used. And I think it's a challenge for airlines because they do go, especially large carriers will fly to multiple destinations across many different countries. In some countries, like in the UK, Australia, in the US, I believe it's mostly in California, it's state specific. There is legislation in terms of anti-slavery, supply chain management. So we're looking at the different things in terms of the legal framework, the responsibilities, the due diligence, dealing with the ethical recruitment of migrant workers, what are the different responsibilities versus the ILO. So this is something that we're hoping to have done by end of next year. And again, starting with the airlines and then going into other areas. So we have a website. So when you get the slides, you have the link there where you can see, you can download these guidelines. They are free. So is the e-learning and my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That sounds like great progress. I'm very glad to see all this work that ICAO is doing, and glad you touched upon some of the key issues that Michel raised in terms of what we can do, like in terms of training and supply chain. I'd like to have your thoughts on what you think are the key issues with the practical implementation of these measures that would help aviation combat human trafficking.
Yeah, I think one of the main issues, and as I mentioned, this is what kind of spun the second set of guidelines, is the reporting. I think in aviation, we typically tend to work through data mining, through safety intelligence. So to take risk-informed decisions, we do risk assessments. And this is an area where I think data collection analysis, I think, are the next big thing we need in terms of addressing this. I think there's a misconception that there's a lot of work to do in terms of the legal aspects, because when we started working on this, the sort of the natural parallel was unruly passengers as a kind of what looks like this. And I think we had a lot of these discussions in the group, and it's not the same. I think ICAO's facilitated, and we mentioned the Montreal Protocol before, we facilitated a lot of work around the legal aspects of having to define offenses that are committed on board, and what are the legal tools the state needs to have. So if somebody is caught smoking in the lavatory, and we know that then the plane will land somewhere, and because in that country it's not considered an offense, the passenger will just get a slap on the wrist and walk off. So that's the kind of thing where the state will need the tools to go to help the airline and in response to that offense, because you can smoke on the street, it's not a crime. But if you do it on an aircraft, you're endangering lives. So I think for trafficking is a crime. I think the majority of states are signatory to the Palermo Protocol. So I think the groundwork is laid out because it's not context related. Trafficking is trafficking, it's a crime. So I think what we need now is better data collection and analysis. I think for different reasons, what I see now is for airlines that are actually looking at this, it can be proactive. Some airlines have started identifying, for example, trends in routes. There are some routes that are more problematic. So, or countries of origin or destination. So I think from a sort of a risk-based approach, those are flights where the crew would probably be more vigilant because it's most likely to happen. And down to the point where airlines that are looking at this will even know, for example, some routes are very, very prone to organ trafficking versus other types of trafficking. Where even children are being moved for the purpose of organ removal. So I mentioned this also when we were prepping for this. I've seen cases where going through the data, they even realized all the tickets for these traffickers and victims were actually being purchased at the same travel agency in the same village in the same country. So I think that then allows us to go a bit up the chain in terms of what law enforcement may do. And then I think also in terms of justifying, because that's also aviation is also a business, in terms of justifying the costs that are related to things like implementing training. If we can see the benefits from crew being trained, although I think, as we said, it is a crime that's unfortunately, to get to prosecution and sentencing, it's quite difficult. But if we can see the sort of the positive outcome of training personnel, then I think that's also a benefit. And for that, we need data analysis.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So that's a good segue into a few words maybe from Linda in terms of what IATA can do. And I do want to highlight, maybe for those who are less practically embedded into the industry, that IATA does excellent work at setting standards and practices for airlines. And so the connection with our airlines is very direct with IATA. So Linda, do you want to tell us a bit about what is being done right now by IATA to enhance awareness of airlines around this?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me well? Perfect. Okay, thank you, and good evening, good day, everyone. If I have the time, I would share a bit of the presentation that we have prepared to show what IATA has done over the years. Okay, here we go. Can you see it?
Not yet, Linda. Okay, here it is.
Okay, so over the next few minutes, I would like to explain the perspective of the aviation industry and the airline industry in particular, especially considering the current as well geopolitical situation after COVID. Let me see if I can move my slides. Yes, so first of all, a few words on who is IATA. IATA is the trade association for the world's airlines. We represent something like 300 airlines in 120 countries, and we carry most of the global air traffic. We represent and advocate for the airline industry, and we lead and serve the industry as well by providing standards and recommended practices and advocating for the interests of our members. So I was mentioning before about the two situations that we have witnessed over the last few years. The first one is the economic impact of COVID-19. So it is believed that COVID-19 increased the number of people who are at risk of trafficking, and this is why this is because the government diverted the resources away from anti-trafficking efforts to the pandemic. And then the second thing that we have witnessed over the years, especially during last year, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is believed that 5 million have left their country, Ukraine, especially Ukraine, for neighboring countries, while 7 million people are still thought to be displaced into Ukraine itself. So the invasion has impacted as well energy and food prices, and this has caused inflation and that is leaving many people struggling. So poverty is a condition as well for the exploitation of human beings. So this is something that has not been tackled before. And then finally, when we started this program in IATA, it was in 2017. So why we started this? Because our Director General it was referring to IATA as the business of freedom, because aviation, not to IATA, but to aviation connects the world, it brings connectivity, delivers social and economic benefits to the community. But according to the UNODC, it is also mentioned that 60% of trafficked persons cross at least one international borders. And so this means that persons move from traffickers move the victim from one place to the other. So at the time that we speak, it is very possible that there are victims on board of the aircraft, on board of the plane. So what we are going to do to help those people and to make sure that we support help eliminating this crime. So this is what we did. First of all, why airlines are interested in tackling trafficking. When we started working on this project, we engaged some of our members, and they were of the opinion that this is the job of law enforcement, because it's a crime, so it's about law enforcement. What about reporting false negatives? Won't innocent passengers get caught up? So what will we do? We do if we report and it's not true. Then when we spoke about training, some of them said we have already operational training programs and we don't have time to put in trafficking as well. So we had to, because there was no legislation on human trafficking. But when we presented actually our policy position and proposal to support carriers, we got an overwhelming support through an AGM resolution that was passed in Sydney in 2017. This is because there are good reasons why airlines are interested to be involved in identifying the victims of human trafficking. First of all, there is the moral obligation. This is the right thing to do. This is a crime, and there are victims and there are human beings. Then there are specific and general regulations related to human trafficking. In some cases, those regulations are general regulations, like, for example, the Modern Slavery Act in Australia or in the UK. In other cases, such as, for example, in the United States, there are specific requirements for training cabin crew and public-facing staff. So not only cabin crew, but also the staff at the airport, the staff that talks to the passengers. Because sometimes when the passengers, when those victims are in the aircraft, it's already too late. So the first we identify the victims, and better is for those victims not to even taking the aircraft. Sometimes they take the aircraft, we are not able to identify, and they are lost forever, because this is a crime hidden in plain sight. So if we get ahead of the curve, is better for everyone. And then also because there is a major focus on SDG, for example, as Martin was mentioning. This is part of the two main SDG, is the 5.8, if I'm not wrong, and the 8.7, 5.2 and 8.7. So there is specific indication and need to identify the victims and report for prosecutors. And then there is also the security considerations, because dealing with trafficking makes security sense. For example, there is a considerable evidence that terrorist organizations fund their operations from human trafficking and other crimes. Those operations, as we saw on 9/11, tragically target international civil aviation. So anything we can do to choke off that funding has to be a good thing. So let me go to the next slide. This is how IATA started developing our policy position and the approach. When we started, it was a bit overwhelming because there are many initiatives, there are many regulations, there is nothing specific on aviation, and we didn't really know where to start. We knew that we had a problem. We don't know how to solve this problem, how to tackle it. And sometimes it was a bit complicated. Our reference, in the first instance, was from the multilateral perspective that we got by talking to the UNODC in Vienna, because those are the keeper of the Palermo Protocol. Indeed, actually, was helpful because the UNODC approached us, asked us to take actions. So, in the sense that the aviation industry is involved because we are the means of transport. We transport the victims, not only the aviation industry, all the transport industry. So the United States at that time had already identified the transportation as the key sector that could help fighting human trafficking. So they had already started some campaigns, like for example the Blue Campaign, that was one of the first. And in 2016, the United States mandated airlines already to provide human trafficking and awareness training for cabin crew and flight attendants. So we started basically from there. What we did, IATA is already working, and Martin already mentioned that we are working with the ICAO, the United Nations, and have helped as well with our airlines to develop guidance material and so on. I will not go on this in regards of the reducing modern slavery in the supply chain, because Martin has already covered. So, but what IATA is doing for the members, I mentioned already the resolution, the AGM resolution that you see here in the screen that was passed in 2017. So we started with a multi-layered strategy. First of all, the awareness raising, then providing airlines with practical tools, and then the partnership through the advocacy, through the partnership with the specific governments and international organizations, NGOs, and so on. In regards of awareness raising, we started with videos. So we started with videos, with infographics that you see here. The infographics is about our campaign that we run. We are running now since 2017. We launched it during the AGM. It is the Eyes Open campaign. The videos, there is an interesting video if you want to watch on the IATA website, and also having events like together with the International Organization for Migration. We already got events in France, Japan, and Switzerland. We held an event in 2018 with the UK Modern Slavery Delivery Group. So raising awareness that we are doing all what we can, but also raising awareness about this crime. Then we launched practical tools. So, for example, with guidance, policy guidance for the members. What they are supposed to do in case they witness a case or they witness a suspected case of human trafficking on board of the aircraft or at the airport, but also what they don't have to do. So we used the principle of do not harm. So thinking to them, not only to denounce the human trafficking case, but or suspected human trafficking case, but also to help the victim. So do not harm, to making sure that the possible victims that has been identified is not harmed. Then we launched as well some e-learning. There are two modules. There is a free module on our website and a more advanced module that gives the right to have a certificate, and also in-person classroom training. This is for the practical. Also, airlines are mobilizing. Here I have put in the screen on the screen some of the campaigns that have been run by airlines, but also by state regulators like Qatar, for example, who together with Qatar Airways, they launched a human trafficking forum in 2018 that supported advancing laws, infrastructures, and programs and policies to prevent the human trafficking. And also other airlines that have launched their own initiatives, or together with IATA and ICAO. Some other airlines are participating to other campaigns. For example, here I put on the screen the campaign that was launched by the UNODC, Aquí Estoy, in South America, especially in some parts of South America where the countries have been identified as sourcing countries by the state regulators. So how we can help not only to identify possible victims, but how we can help raising awareness of this crime. Because one of the things that we have realized over these years is that education is the most important thing. For example, when we started developing the training, I remember that I was looking at some of the trainings delivered by Middle East countries, delivered to the children. So how to teach to the children, what trafficking is, how not to trust, and what are the signs of the trafficking. That's really was something that for me meant a lot, because education starts from from the child. So this to conclude the presentation. So we think that a lot has been said until now, but no one sector or group can tackle this human trafficking on its own. So we need to partnership between all the stakeholders. We are very clear on the extent that airline personnel can help. We know as well that they are not law enforcement, so our position is that they should never get involved, by simply report what they see. So if you see something, say something. This should start not only on board, should start at the airport. Airlines are committed to help, of course, for example, through awareness raising and training and reporting. But similar training is required for the value chain. For example, for traffic controllers and caterers, handlers, and so on. We also think that training and efforts to report human trafficking will only be effective if there are simple ways to report and get timely information to law enforcement, so they can make informed decisions. This is not always easy, especially when when aircraft is in flight. And so what we do, we always urge law enforcement to provide us with clear indications and contact details to facilitate reporting, give the best chance to stop suspected trafficking. We know as well that post-COVID and given the geopolitical situation, transport providers need to be more and more aware of the role that they play to prevent this crime. That's why we coordinate and cooperate with law enforcement as well, national enforcement bodies, and mostly with the ICAO and UNO, with the United Nations, with the human rights. And this concludes my presentation, Martin.
Thank you, Linda. That was very informative. I think you also answered my next question. So you spoke about enhancing awareness and sensitivity. I had a question around, what specific processes are in place to for an airline when faced with an active ongoing case that they suspect. What processes are in place? You mentioned reporting, grabbing contact details, coordinating with law enforcement. I assume training as well has components of sort of what to say, what not to say. Did you have any additional comments on that?
Yes, when, for example, when the airline, they suspect cases of human trafficking, what we ask them is to be very, not to face the perpetrator or to approach the victim, but to watch really and to communicate with the other members, with the other cabin crew. So to see if the suspect is real, and then to report, to contact the pilot in command with the information. The pilot will inform either their operations control or station management or the handler, who in turn will contact the police department or the national enforcement body or whomever is in charge of addressing the issue of human trafficking. What we ask as well to the police, for example, because it's different in each country. Sometimes it's different in each airport to whom you have to report. So we ask, for example, state regulators to give us clear indications to whom we have to report. If there is, for example, a number that we can call, or an association that will take care of the victims, they will stop the perpetrator and then they will take care of the victims after. So what we ask as well to the police or to whomever is in charge is not to meet the person at the aircraft, but for example, to wait until, for example, at the immigration, because sometimes it can create even more confusion, and it could even create issues for the cabin crew. We have to protect the cabin crew. We have to make sure that we report what we witness, but we also have to protect our cabin crew. So we ask as well, for example, enforcement bodies not to contact the cabin crew, or to make sure that this is anonymous. The reporting is anonymous. That's why we don't know, most of the times, we don't know what happens thereafter with the victims and with the perpetrators.
Yep. And do you have a sense of how successful these measures have been so far?
Unfortunately, we don't, because we don't know what happens after, for the reasons that I was mentioning, because it's a crime, so it is treated as such. We don't know what happens with the victim. We collaborate with some of the associations who support the victims once they are identified, but we don't have the numbers, we don't have the data. We have indications of what are the sourcing countries from different studies. For example, the United States, they have this reporting that they issue, if I'm not wrong, every 2 years, where they look at the countries from 3 tiers, the first, the second, and the third. The second tier are those countries who know that they have issues of human trafficking, and they are taking actions. And the third tier is the countries, let's say the red countries, where they know that there is an issue in terms of providing the victims, but also in terms of receiving the perpetrators. Because human trafficking, yes, there is also that. There is those sexual tourism, for example, in certain countries. And this is another issue. So there are two parts. So there are countries who provide the victims, are sourcing, but also there are countries who are receiving, who receive the passengers and the tourists for certain specific scopes, especially with children and so on. And this is the most awful things, probably, together with exploitation for organs and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hopefully, with time, there'll be more light shed onto this, how successful these measures have been. So I'll turn perhaps to the questions in the chat, and then to questions from the audience. And I see that there's been a number of questions, and I encourage any one of you who've put questions in, when I address your question, if you have anything to add, please speak up. And I think that the first question is from Tisa around statistics on the number of countries that have enacted specific legislation on human trafficking. I don't know if there's anyone who want to take this question first. Youla?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. As I said before, we have around 180 countries who are party to the Transnational Convention and the Palermo Protocol. From my humble knowledge, working with several countries around the globe, we have around maybe 172 up to date that has adopted national legislation and criminalized the issue of trafficking. Some other countries, they do criminalize, but it is in the criminal code. It's not in a dedicated law to combat trafficking. So I can say we have, when it comes to the legal framework, even at the national level, it's well established. The problem is not in having a good law. A good law is not good if it's not properly implemented. A lot of countries lack the expertise on how to identify victims. They are not proactive, they are passive, they wait for others to point out a case. No, they need to be trained to be proactive. Some of them, they don't even keep data, and data is very important. And I would highlight also an important issue. Legal mutual assistance is very important because sometimes it's a cross-border crime. So countries need to exchange information about routes, trends, trafficking flows, from which region to which region, and do mutual agreements to exchange information. In that way, they can really work on it. So the legal framework is there, but if you don't have good implementation, it won't be as effective as it should be.
Of course.
A lot of countries, I've seen that, I've heard that from judges. Some of them, they complain, we don't know how to educate cases of trafficking because where is the evidence? How do we create the evidence? It's really very complicated. So it needs a lot of work. But let me just add something. First and foremost, states are accountable. It's not the accountability of airlines, the UN. No, states are accountable at the outset. They need to, sometimes they are accountable due to lack of action or the wrong action. So they need to take action in order to be able to combat the crime. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Professor Crépeau, Saveline asks that you mentioned several countries adopt practices to aid victims and survivors of human trafficking to testify in court, and that these practices failed. Can you speak more about this?
Yeah. Initially, what states have been doing was to try to have the cooperation of the victims in order to prosecute the traffickers. And so there was this, in several countries, there were plans to create a residence permit for 6 months for 1 year, conditional on working with the authorities and testifying in court, which means testifying in public, because trials are generally public. There are ways of hiding the identity of informers, etc., but very often this is not difficult to overcome. If you want to know the identity, you often will. And so victims were, and very often rightly so, very afraid of being identified by the traffickers and being punished for it at a later date, and would refuse to cooperate or cooperate meaningfully. And so it has led to not extraordinary results in many countries. They haven't been able to prosecute a lot more because of that. Then several countries have done, I mean, the right thing, which is to when a victim is identified, you provide them with a 1 year, at least a 1 year residence permit to help them, settle down or reorganize their life, and get into another course in order to, decide what they want to do after the ordeal they went through. And they said, if you want, you can cooperate with us. And that led to not much more cooperation, but at least much more willing cooperation. It was not conditional on getting the permit. And so that's good. The other thing that has been done was to fund civil society organizations that help victims. One of the oldest civil society organizations in the world that help victims of trafficking was Veuthey in the Netherlands, which is very well known to the people who work in the field. The idea is to make sure that the victims are in a safe environment, protected from the traffickers, and that also helps the victims. It doesn't always help the prosecution, but it helps the victims. So these are ways to help, to help the environment. The question is always, what is the objective of the state? Is it to fight crime? Is it to help individuals? Or is it to eradicate the conditions that make the crime possible? And unfortunately, very often the criminal approach, and Michel mentioned that quite forcefully, the criminal approach is only one aspect, and maybe not the most important one. The most important one is to eradicate the conditions in which the crime is made possible, and to help people. And that is not always what the states are doing.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Brandy had a couple of points. I think the first one was around, I thought that was interesting. What are the types of technologies that exist to help people escape a situation of trafficking? Who wants to take that?
Can you please repeat?
What type of technologies are in place to help someone escape a situation of trafficking that they may be in? This is how I understood Brandy's question. Michel,
if nobody is willing, I'm happy to say something.
Michel, you're on mute. I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
So, Martin, I think it's a quite interesting question, but it's ways between, I may say, traffickers and victims, or even traffickers and police, because actually you can see that technology is used to trap victims, for example, on social networks, or with different traps. But then you want to get out of this, then definitely you need also to have I would say, similar responses, defenses. And so you will have, obviously, applications, which could help, for example, parents prevent kids being trapped into this. But you could also have on social networks, you could also have people advertising for ways and means to get out of slavery. But clearly, the OHCHR did make a report on combating trafficking in human beings in 2018-2019, and now Professor Obokata is just asking for the General Assembly of this September contributions for technology and human trafficking. So again, it's an ongoing question, and I don't think there is any silver bullet yet, because, for example, if you say technology, for example, you have satellite pictures, and satellite pictures will give you the exact location of a ship fishing in the Malacca Straits, and these fishers are actually slave workers. Yes, but I think it's very difficult. It's an exception. Then also you have other technologies used by banks, and actually including in Canada, to monitor traffic, to monitor transfers of funds. And then when they have a suspicion, I would say just if a bank has a suspicion, then she informs the police, and the police tries to locate the traffickers. So those are two examples, but obviously, as you know, there are many ways to transfer funds, and there are difficult ways also to monitor those. Then definitely you could also have technology taking pictures of faces, and then if people look suspicious, or if people look not too well, possibly to approach them and so on. But of course, every time you have the technology, you need to have a human person taking steps to actually implement or to enforce or whatever. But technology is by itself not enough.
That's interesting. I know that biometrics is something that's being rolled out quite significantly throughout the industry, and so so perhaps there's hope that this tool can help us. Brandy, are you satisfied with this response? Did this answer your question? Did you have any other sort of aspect of this, or any of the speakers? Do you want to add anything about this?
Yes, I would like to add something.
Please, Youla.
Thank you. Yeah, technology can be used in a negative way and in a positive way. Negative way, we all know the online recruitment, especially through the pandemic, it has been witnessed that there is an increase in using technology in recruiting victims and exploiting them online even. The positive side, of course, we are all working on that. OHCHR did a paper. We at the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking also did a paper on the use of technology in combating trafficking. There are a lot of applications. There is a project currently with Facebook on developing a lexicon to identify the words that can be used in recruiting victims or giving any indication that something is not right. I have been working with Ernst & Young on developing blockchains to monitor forced labor. So it will be a whole process where it's very transparent and can help in identifying victim or preventing. It is mainly as a preventive measure. On biometrics, and I would be a little bit cautious. I know it's a very effective tool and it's useful, but we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of profiling people and infringing their human rights. So this is a new area. We are still, all of us are thinking of it and considering options and putting plans and coming up with ideas. I hope it will be used for the better, not the worse.
Yeah,
so
thank you. No, and I've heard also for ourselves at Air Canada, this is an issue where, you know, the cases that have been reported are not necessarily true human trafficking cases. So that issue is very real. And I saw there was a whole discussion in the chat here about airline liability on this. Unfortunately, Andy's had to leave us, but certainly liability of, you know, both failure to act and having wrongly acted could be a question. On this point of technology, Brandy had a follow-up comment regarding this initiative, Darkness to Hope, that is being piloted. Did you want to say a few words about that, Brandy? I see your mute button is on.
Are you asking me? No.
No, there was someone in the chat who had this question.
Okay.
And we can't hear from them, so I'll skip to the next one.
Because participants are not able to unmute, so I would need to give specific permission to the participant.
Okay, my apologies. So,
but if you want, I can do that. That's not a problem.
Sure.
Martin, can I jump in just with regards to the question of reporting and false positives?
Please, yes.
So I think one of the things, and I think Linda also touched on this, but one of the things, and I have to say I'm not a lawyer, so in terms of the liability side, but I think one of the big keys that we teach in the training is that crew report on a suspicion. That's what they're reporting on. So they have not witnessed a crime. They haven't witnessed the crime of trafficking. You know, if I see somebody get carjacked on the street, the police comes, I witnessed the crime of the car being robbed, and then they will interview me as a witness. I think what we explain in training is it's not like an assault in an aircraft where one passenger passenges the other and you witness an assault. You have a suspicion. What you report to the pilots and what the pilots relate to the ground is a suspicion that you have. So you're not accusing the passenger of having committed the crime. You have a suspicion, and it is law enforcement based on that information that will then make a decision on whether or not they intervene. And I'm not sure in terms of the liability, but that's so in terms of the crew, because this is the question that comes up, of course, in training. What if I'm wrong? Yeah. You know, and then the passenger gets pulled aside. And I think typically, and then typically the way it's also typically handled differently than an unruly passenger case where police meet the aircraft, they come on board, they grab the person and cuff them if it's been something really horrible. Typically, I think in a lot of these cases, and again, we go through this in training, passengers will disembark, and they will typically, things that will be done, coordinated, will be something like a secondary customs inspection. So where they believe they're getting their bags checked, and then they may be then at that point questioned. So there's also, I can say, kind of a distance from the actual crew. It's not the kind of situation where they'll come on board and they'll take them. So I think a lot of this is what we tell the crew is you have a suspicion, so you can report on that suspicion, and that's also where it ends. You're not accusing somebody, or the airline's not accusing somebody. They're just relaying a concern to law enforcement, who then ultimately will make the decision of what they do. And it may be to do nothing if they don't feel it's enough of a case.
Thank you. That's a good point, and it highlights even more the importance of doing nothing more than reporting, right? And the whole do no harm thing. Linda, did you want to add anything?
No, and I agree. No, I wanted to say that I agree with Martin. Actually, what we do, there are a series of indicators that evidence that the person could be a victim. So based on those indicators, the cabin crew they start really watching at what they think could be the victim, and then they don't really report. They try to prevent. It's it's not like because the prosecution is for the national enforcement bodies. What we do, we prevent that this is happening. So in my opinion, again, I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, there is no liability in this sense, because you report only your suspicious. I mean, based on the series of indicators that are there are many. For example, there are cases where victims, they don't even hold their passport, or you see the passport is presented by at the check-in. They don't keep their passport, but the passport is held by another person. Or, for example, we have been cases. The most famous case was the two girls that were traveling to Paris with a one-way ticket, because they were said that they were going to a show or something like that, and they had no return ticket. That was a case of human trafficking, for example, that was reported at the airport, and the guy had contacted the girls on Facebook, and then he disappeared. When they tried to call him, the girls, he was not on Facebook anymore, so he had canceled his profile. And so in my opinion, there is no really liability, because we are not saying that someone is being trafficked, but that we have suspicions. And again, there are all a list of indicators that are available. We put also on our website. That's it.
Thank you. Brandy, are you able to speak now?
I can definitely speak. Thank you.
Very good.
I wanted to thank you all for taking my questions and follow-up. My organization, we're located in the United States, but we have ties internationally. What we are doing is we are working through some technology in order to assist hospitality in the detection and deterrence of human trafficking. And I was actually in my LinkedIn this morning and found this conference, so I said I might as well take it because I'm the recording secretary and serial networker of this organization. The technology is called the Hope button, and it's just basically a discrete button that would be put on a phone that, in the instance that a person being trafficked has some time away from their trafficker, if they're waiting for their next client, and I know that's an awful way to put that they would be able to push that button and summon help discreetly, just depending on how the technology was put into the hotel. And I was thinking about something like that for aviation.
So this is a physical button that gets installed in hotel rooms.
Okay, like this one would be on a phone, just a dedicated button, which I know of providers that can do that, because we've been talking about this for a while. I'd love to talk about how that might be of good use in aviation, be it in a bathroom on a plane, be it in an airport, just be it some way that, again, just discreetly, that someone could depress that. One of the airline personnel would get that type of message as to where it is on the plane and then basically take action.
Mm-hmm. You've got a whole set of Wi-Fi issues there in your question as well. But
I know.
Thank you for your comments.
I know.
We'll take it away. I'm sure Linda's taken notes, and we'll look into this. Thank you. There was an additional question here from, just find it again. So Eham, I think we've covered your question in respect of what the aviation industry is doing. So, but please drop a line maybe in the chat. I don't know if Stefan Michael has to unmute you if you want to speak, but if you want to hear more about specific aviation related initiatives, I might move on to the next question around the sorry, I'm trying to find my question again. There was one around definition that I wanted to throw back to Professor Crépeau, because that was an interesting comment that he started with at the beginning of this webinar. And the question is around whether there's an intent to reform or improve the definition.
Probably someone from UNODC would be more better informed to answer that question. I personally haven't heard of any concerted effort to remedy the difficulties with the trafficking definition. So maybe someone of UNODC would be better informed. But if you have time, I have suggestions.
Youla, did you want to answer that?
Yes, Professor Crépeau, and I'm not from UNODC, I'm from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but I work with UNODC on a daily basis. I'm really too much into the convention and the protocol. No, there are no attempts to change the definition, and I don't see the definition to be that complicated. It defines the different steps. Consent, you mentioned at the beginning, the issue of consent. The consent is not regarded only in the case of children, but in the case of adults, it is, consent should be looked at. Because if you are engaging in an act with your full consent, you're not vulnerable, so it's up to you. And that applies mainly to engaging in prostitution / sex work. So this is a different area. The convention, the definition in the Palermo Protocol is open-ended. It kept the door open for all forms of new and let's say new forms of trafficking. So there are a lot of literature about the different harboring, transportation, everything. We have really unpacked those terms. So if you're interested, I can send you some of the studies that we have done at the interagency coordination group on that. But I promise you the definition is not going to finish, because now UNODC is embarking on establishing this new monitoring mechanism. However, when the new mechanism is in place, just like treaty bodies, the human rights treaty bodies, it can assist in explaining and unpacking some of the ambitious terms and concepts in the definition and in the protocol in general. I hope that helps.
Well, I think there is time, Professor Crépeau, for you to chime in with some suggestions to improve the definition.
Yes.
It was not about improving the definition. It was about improving the perspective on which the whole anti-trafficking operations are functioning. One of the key issues for trafficking victims, as well as for smuggled migrants, is that both of them very often want to move either to the big city or to another country to have a better future for themselves, very often a better future for their family, pay the medical bills of the parents, pay the education of the children, etc., and support the family. That's what they need, because they don't find this at home and they need to move. So some will be able to raise money by incurring debt or by selling something and pay a smuggler and go. Others have nothing and they will be enticed by lies and promises, false promises, and they will find themselves in a trafficking ring. In both cases, the issue is that they're not allowed to move. And it's to overcome the barriers of border controls and migration restrictions that they use the service, or they are enticed by false promises to get into trafficking rings. The SDGs were mentioned. The SDGs, target 10.7 and the Global Compact on Migration both say, and that's states saying it, it's not the wet dream of a mad professor, both are saying that states should facilitate mobility. And in the Global Compact for Migration, it is said that states should offer a lot more mechanisms to travel legally, so avenues or options for traveling legally. States should regularize undocumented migrants. States should allow families to join their family member abroad, etc. There's 23 objectives in the Global Compact. Mobility should be facilitated, and this would empower migrants. If you are in a legal situation, if you're not obliged to resort to to illegal means, either through smuggling, even though you, according to the protocol, you can't be prosecuted for that, or if you're not often letting yourself being enticed by false promises and finding yourself in a very bad situation, if you're empowered to use, to raise money in order to buy a plane ticket, which costs usually much less than a smuggling operation, and will cost much less personally and financially than a trafficking ring, you're empowered and you can denounce violence. It would not suppress trafficking. It would probably suppress most of the smuggling. There was almost no smuggling to Europe in the 60s and 70s when millions of Turks and North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans entered Europe, and there was almost no smuggling between Mexico and the US until the mid 70s, because people could come and go through the border. Smuggling is entirely policy induced. Trafficking is not. Trafficking has a part of it which, because it is a crime, smuggling is not. Because it is a crime, it's not simply policy induced. It exists. People are there to exploit other people. But by empowering the individuals, you would allow them to find other solutions, and you would allow them to say no to a tempting solution, which is a bad idea, because they have no other options. And so states are actually today doing the opposite of what they've committed to in the SDGs, target 8.7, and in the Global Compact on Migration. And I'm hoping to see progress on this in the coming decades, but I fear that we'll have to wait for another generation.
That's a very good point. I think this issue of migration may raise a whole bunch of other concerns in other areas. We're wondering, Michel, if you could tell us a bit about what the Order of Malta's activities are in the area of human trafficking.
Yes. No, thank you very much. Actually, I should have shown another slide, because we're doing three things. And one thing is raising awareness, and raising awareness through websites, but also through online courses in English, French, Italian, and German. So you could find those courses on a website, which is cuhd.org, then sharing best practices, and that's also on the website christusliberat.org, and then promoting action. And then this action could be prevention. For example, we had special programs in Ukraine and in neighboring countries when you had people coming out of Ukraine with leaflets also, or with people trying to tell them that they might be victims of human traffickers, and including in Western European countries. Then also on protection, we support, for example, religious congregations in Nigeria, which have a shelter house, Bakita house, for prostitutes returning home. And in order to avoid that they will be re-trafficked, those nuns provide them with not only medical and psychological care, but also with professional training, because unfortunately this rehabilitation might take a long time. And then, as you mentioned, actually, we organized 25 webinars since October 2020 on recovery, international advocacy, health, trauma, healing, then also on the role of technology. That was on the 5th of May 2021. Also on criminal prosecution, and there I must say we had two experts on criminal prosecution, Judge Fausto Pocar and Kevin Highland, and both being very disappointed, I must say, about about the result of criminal prosecution at the international level, saying, you know, at the international level for the ICC, International Criminal Court in The Hague, they are looking for big fishes, and traffickers they can catch are small fishes, are not interesting. And then the question of criminal prosecution before national courts, and I think it was mentioned by Francois Crépeau, that's difficult for judges, difficult for attorneys at law to gather elements of evidence. And so it will be much easier to say, okay, this poor woman was hit, and that's all we can see. And to have also the victims testifying is also a very difficult process. So that's why I must say criminal prosecution is interesting. Of course, lawyers are very much interested in that, but if you look at the practice, it's very difficult. So then I would completely agree also with Francois Crépeau saying that actually building walls, not only material walls, but also legislative walls against refugees and migrants is unfortunately driving people into the hands not only of smugglers, but also of traffickers. And some people in Africa, but not only in Africa, will do whatever, will take unbelievable risks, because some people had told them, you know, if you try to walk across the desert, if you try to board a ship in Libya, you will run the risk of being ransomed and even not being able to cross the sea. So I think there are many ways to deal with human trafficking, but one good way might be actually to reconsider migration processes and also to reconsider refugee processes. And just one last word, because, you know, the High Commissioner for Refugees is preparing for the end of the year, and actually 2 days after the High Commissioner for Human Rights will be gathering a high-level event on human rights for the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. But the High Commissioner for Refugees is from the 13th to the 15th of December organizing in Geneva a global refugee forum. And I would say, we hope, at least there was already one preparatory meeting, and I was asking the High Commissioner for Protection, and she told me, oh, you know, human trafficking, none of our business. Look at UNODC, look at OHCHR. And fortunately, there was another person, and this other person told me, yes, of course, we should work with other UN agencies in order to be able to identify, protect, and then know what to do with those victims. But I must say that was the same case for many years with the ICRC, saying, no, we are not dealing with human trafficking victims, and now opening their eyes and saying, yes, there are victims of human trafficking, even among the civilians we are trying to help. So that's why I must say we are doing also some lobbying in Geneva, in New York, definitely also through our bilateral ambassadors. We have 112 ambassadors in the world, and we have also this international humanitarian organization, Maltese International, and trying through all this network to do some advocacy, to do some protection, and also building partnerships. Because partnerships, for example, you have networks like CodeNet or Alliance 8.7. Both are networks, or Talitacum, that's the third network, who share good practices and help training actually religious congregations or other people interested. So that's what I wanted to tell you. Indeed, there is much work to do. And also one last point is the Santa Marta Group. And the Santa Marta Group, I don't know whether you're aware, but the Santa Marta Group is a group which was established by Pope Francis, having Catholic and also Anglican bishops working with ministries of justice to try precisely to improve the prosecution. So to tell you that quite often, and we did that, the Order of Malta, we did that in October 19, when we organized a conference on women victims of human trafficking in Nigeria. And we invited not only the ambassador of Nigeria in Paris, but also we invited police officers and judges from the Edo state, so in the north, where you have most trafficking victims, and we put them together. And obviously, next to the official statements, they had opportunities to establish contacts. And I think this is also something we should try to do, is to put people together, and that's what we try to do with our webinars, but still, you could do that also at McGill or in other places, and to put people together, not only from Canada, but also from other countries, so that they will not only know legal, I must say, mechanisms or so, but they will know each other, because the human factor, if you say, okay, I don't want to ask my ambassador to ask you, ambassador, or to ask your ministry, but actually to take your phone or to take an email and actually to try to work together without asking for too much red tape, you see. So that's in a nutshell what I could say.
So it's interesting. Thank you, Ambassador Veuthey. I wanted to focus on one thing you said, because it's ça entrecoupe with what Professor Crépeau said around improving, facilitating migration. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what would be needed in terms of concrete next steps. I realize that the prediction is for the next generation to be taking care of this, but concretely, what would it mean for the world to move towards this? Are we talking about an international convention or something? And if so, sort of, I'd love to know what's missing from the current framework around refugees, for example.
If I may just say one word, obviously, you will have business and possibly even unions interested in facilitating migration. Because if I see only Switzerland, we are missing a lot of workers, not only in hospitals, but also in hotels. So the tourism industry is lacking staff. So that's why then they will have to push governments, but they will have also to push public opinion to accept that migration is a good thing. And migration is not only a good thing on the humanitarian side, but migration is a good thing on the societal side, meaning that we will all benefit, not only businesses, but also if you visit a hospital and you are treated by, I don't know, foreign medical doctors or foreign nurses, you certainly are happy about this. And that's, I think we need really public opinion to be aware that if you don't want children, you will need possibly to import population, and this population could be, of course, sorted out by whatever is needed in your country, and I think Canada obviously knows that better than many European countries, but possibly European countries could learn from immigration policies from Canada, and and thank you for sharing your best practices.
Professor Crépeau, did you want to add anything?
Canada has some good practices, but Canada, as other countries, is trying to prevent low-wage migration to come. President Biden just announced quite harsh measures against asylum seekers seeking to cross the American border. And Canada has been trying to expand the Safe Third Country Agreement we have with the US so that we can send back to the US all the asylum seekers that come through the US to Canada. So Canada is not a perfect country on that. I think that at one point, states, I'll start from the beginning. The problem with migration policies is that they are made by non-migrants, the politicians, for non-migrants, their electorate. Migrants are not participating at all. They do not bring their lived life experience to the elaboration of migration policies. Just like, let's say, 100 years ago, policies about women were made by committees of men. They had no idea what they were talking about, and their policies were based on fantasies, myths, fears, whatever. And migration policies are today very often based on that. The reason being that the only really mobilizable electorate on migration policies is the anti-immigration electorate. The other people, those who are not anti-immigration ideologically, have many other reasons to vote. We have to vote on the healthcare for ourselves or our parent, the education of our children, the potholes in our streets, climate change, etc. We have many other reasons. While the ideologically bent electorate that is anti-immigration and is focused on identity politics will vote against any type of migration. So politicians, left and right, are looking at that 10–15% of the electorate, and elections are often won by less than that, and they cater to that electorate. So that's one big issue. As long as migrants will not participate in the debates about migration policies, when they will not bring to the public debate what they bring to society, how they enhance our lives on a daily basis. We've discovered, aspects of that during the pandemic, when we discovered, for example, in Quebec, we called them guardian angels, all those people who worked in the healthcare system, often without papers, but were, you know, taking care of our parents, grandparents, cousins, family members in hospital. We called them guardian angels, but we didn't give them much better working conditions, I can tell you. That's one big issue. So we'll have to change tack. We'll have to change the mindset. And politicians at one point, as soon as they can get rid of that obsession of that anti-immigration electorate, will be able to change the kind of policies that we've adopted for the past 40 years. The problem in doing this is that now we have a structural economic issue. We have several non-delocalizable economic sectors that are addicted to cheap labor in agriculture, in construction, in care, in domestic work, in hospitality, fisheries, mining. You have, depending on the country, you cannot delocalize that. And so we've delocalized working labor conditions from the south to the north. And we now have farms and hospitality, hotels and restaurants whose margins, you know, profit margins are very low. They cannot, you know, they're paying the people who wash the dishes, for example, $4 an hour, $5 an hour, which is well below minimum salary. If tomorrow you change those labor conditions and oblige them to pay at least minimum salary, they will fold. They will just go belly up. They won't be able to sustain the increase. So what we need is to have long-term strategic planning of mobility and of migration. And we will need to help these businesses transition into an exploitation-free labor force. And that will take 10, 15 years. But for that, you need strategic planning. Unfortunately, migration policies are the probably only governance area in most of our governments where there's zero strategic planning, or if there is, we don't know about it because it's not made public and it's not subject to public debate. If you look at infrastructure, healthcare, education, urban planning, etc., there is always strategic planning at 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Climate resilience, climate adaptation. There's, you know, people are forecasting what investments will need to be made when in order for us to sustain, to survive climate change. This is done in all areas: agriculture, food security, you name it, energy. It's not done on migration at all, on mobility. No one talks in our societies, you know, how much population should Canada have in 2100? And when we get, while we get there, you know, who do we want? How should we do this? And we see governments who are resisting the calls of business. We see right-wing governments resisting the call of business for increasing immigration, which is a contradiction, political contradiction in terms. But they do that because of that political constraint. They're not serving the migrants at all. They're serving a small electorate which has embedded itself and which dictates the terms of the debate and has been doing so for 40 years. So we have a problem, and I trust there will be a change, but I'm not sure that my generation will be ready to do it.
Thank you very much. I think that was a fantastic mot de la fin, disons, for closing this webinar. Maybe next webinar will be on the election system. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Thank you to our speakers for your enlightening presentations. And I think this puts an end to the webinar. Donald, did you want to say a few words?
Thank you, Martine. I just want to thank again our distinguished guests for their contributions. Also, the questions from the participants who joined us as well. I think there's a lot of scope for further research and collaboration there. What I was really struck by was the concordance between Ambassador Veuthey and Professor Crépeau on the fact of how hard this is to separate out from much broader issues which we'll have to face as a society. But whilst tackling those broader issues, we still have the individual cases that need help now. And balancing that, I think, certainly for those of us who are lawyers, will be something of a challenge. Obviously, this isn't purely a legal solution, but we need to see what we can do in that area as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody and encourage you I believe this will be recorded for those who want to share it later, and encourage you to do that. Thank you, everybody, and thank you very much, Martine, for such an excellent moderatorship.